The first theory that we're going to look at in the social cultural approach is the social cognitive theory, which focuses on how we learn behavior. I've chosen to start with this theory because we recently completed the cognitive approach to behavior and might be familiar with a lot of the ideas that this theory bases itself on. It is also comprehensive to start off with this theory because it gives us one explanation of how we become who we are. Popov, in his book, states that we are not born sexist, racist, nationalist, or chauvinist, that rather we become these things over time. And this becoming happens through processes of socialization and learning. In the biological approach, we learn that we can have genetic predispositions for certain behaviors, but we also know that it is not necessary for this predisposition to manifest into actual behavior. But if it is to manifest, we do need an environmental trigger. And this approach, the sociocultural approach, looks at the very environment that we are referring to when we talk about genetic predisposition and its manifestation. Socialization is the process of becoming a part of a social group and learning the norms of that group. The first socialization that we experience as babies is often with either our parents or a guardian. And they make up our primary socialization along with our peer groups at school and later peer groups as well. Here we often learn attitudes and behaviors regarding gender and also our culture. Secondary socialization is learning from a larger community, your extended family, and even media. And we know that media plays very integral or important roles in today's world, and this could be positive in nature and also negative in nature. So, gender socialization is learning attitudes and behaviors considered appropriate for the gender that we belong to. This form of socialization has been seeing a lot of issues because traditionally it is based on cisgenders, which is the identification of oneself with the sex we are born into or born with. So if I identify myself as being female, as a cisgender, that is based on my sex as a female, right? So in this case, individuals are likely to be dependent on secondary socialization to understand their own norms and attitudes, since not all parents, at least not yet, may not have socialized them with attitudes and norms with regards to other genders. Okay, so we just are typically taught about or socialized into understanding attitudes and behaviors that is appropriate for female and male. We don't know anything about the other, or we're not taught about that yet, at least not in a primary socialization. Our traditional attitudes are also not fully in line with the growing equality between genders. In India, this is becoming especially problematic as boys and girls are typically brought up very differently. And historically, and even till date, a lot of families, they tend to prefer to have a son or have sons over having daughters. And when we do socialize the two genders, the male sons are usually made to believe that they are the dominant gender and that they are entitled to get whatever they want or whatever they desire and need. So this kind of socialization has contributed to the toxic masculinity that you see around in India, where they're not able to accept that women are equals, and they might even go a step ahead to put down women and rather, in their own words or in the attitude that they see it as, put women in place. Okay, and India has been recently known for its monstrous rape culture, which is all has a lot to do with the way gender is or ideas of gender and roles and attitudes towards gender is taught to people in our society. And across cultures, we have also the cultural socialization, which is understanding the general norms of our own culture. So, across cultures, if you look back at gender, the general norms around gender have been that girls are the nurturers and they need to stay at home and take care of domestic needs of the family, whereas boys should fend for the family, which is another common attitude and towards the two genders. And while this has been traditionally the case, things are changing right now, but a lot of the times we're still taught the same thing, that girls should be nurturing, which is not a bad thing, right? I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but that is all that there is to their role as a female, right? And males should be fending for the family. And it's not acceptable if a male is not able to fend for their family, which is again a lot of pressure. Um, and another common attitude is that boys and men should be strong, not cry, and be overly emotional. And this kind of socialization or this kind of attitude towards men and boys also has its own setbacks, which comes in the form of their deteriorating mental health, lack of help-seeking behavior. Right? They do not really vocalize their emotions, nor do they look for help. It can also cause conflict within their relationships, at workplaces, and all other several other domains. So it is difficult for both genders because there are very rigid norms that we have been following over time that seem to be changing because of all the rights that we want equally, right? And without being able to adapt to that, socialization is falling back in making us adaptive to the environment that we are going into. So, like I said, cultural socialization is another form of socialization where individuals learn about their racial, cultural, and ethnic heritage, which includes their values and attitudes and also traditions. In what seems to be a common culture amongst a lot of our Asian cultures is the attitude of humbleness, respect for adults, and also paying a lot of attention to and importance to the family unit that we belong to or the group that we belong to. So, yeah, those are a few attitudes and norms that we might experience. For, even though we belong to different cultures, these are cross-cultural attitudes that are similar for us as belonging to different Asian cultures or collectivistic cultures. So, looking back at the Nazi soldiers who were involved in the Holocaust, they were all brought up in a society that socialized them and taught them that the Jews are less than them, that they are minorities. They caused the German loss of during World War I, and also are the cause for maybe a lot of the poverty that a majority of the Germans were facing then, because the Jews were booming businessmen. So this attitude was internalized and also normalized to a large extent, which caused, again, the normalization or the attitude that it was okay to aggress against this community of people. Okay? And primary socialization plays a key role in our pro-social and antisocial behaviors. And our secondary socialization can play a mediating role, right? So we could learn something from our parents, but a secondary form of socialization can interfere that either in a positive way or a negative way. Okay? If we look at the behaviorist approach to socialization and learning from our group, we are viewed as black boxes, and we have gone over this concept before. It also suggests that we are the result of the input we receive and the output that we dispense, which is going to be common amongst all of us because we are black boxes and we don't interpret what input we receive. Again, this only goes to mean that each one of us in our groups learn everything that we observe and are taught to and is taught to us without any thought or without any interpretation. There are two theories of learning according to behaviorists or the behavioristic approach, which is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is the process by which a neutral stimulus over time becomes associated or conditioned into having a specific response. And the classic example of this is Pavlov's experiment with the dogs. And this conditioning happened between a bell and the salivating response of the dog. The dogs were given their food after the researchers rang a bell. Okay, so every time the bell was rang, they were provided food right after that. At first, this was just a neutral stimulus and was not going to cause any kind of reaction from the dog. But over time, the dogs started associating the bell with food and would salivate whenever the bell was rang because they were anticipating to be fed right after the bell was rang, even if the food was not presented to them. So this is one example of classical conditioning. And operant conditioning is based on principles of consequences. That is, we learn or we are likely to learn a behavior when we are awarded for engaging in it, and also we will avoid or unlearn a behavior if we are punished for engaging in that behavior. An example of classical conditioning for you could be associated with an exam room, the clock in it, and other materials that are neutral but have over time caused an anxious or stressful response because there is a fear of failure. If I were to mention to you that you have a test tomorrow, it is likely that your response would be of stress and to freak out because I have given you very short notice. But here's the thing. According to classical conditioning, this would mean that everyone would associate tests with anxiety, which is quite untrue. There are a lot of people who don't have anxious responses to tests, and this is because they interpret tests differently from those who interpret it as a possibility of failure. Albert Bandura, who was the forerunner or who is the forerunner of the social cognitive theory, argued the same, that the behavioristic approach or approaches were too deterministic and did not account for individual differences, especially our ability to have independent thoughts and decisions. Based on that, he argued an agentic approach to learning, which claims that we are the agents of our own lives. We have control over our behavior. We are capable of developing intentions based on visualization and evaluation of our future and analyzing outcomes and consequences of a certain behavior. We are also capable of evaluating our own abilities and our own goals. So the social cognitive theory then focuses on how we learn through the process of modeling and vicarious reinforcement. The behavioristic approach and theory suggested that we had to personally engage in a behavior in a trial and error manner for us to learn it, which is referred to as direct learning. And it does occur, right? We learn through experience. But Bandura refutes this idea as being the only way of learning, right? And argues that we can indirectly learn as well by observing a behavior of a model and observing the consequences they experience as a result of their behavior, which is what we refer to as vicarious reinforcement, experiencing through the experience of another's reward or punishment. Okay? For example, if we see a brother or a sister of ours rewarded for helping a friend out, that helping behavior is vicariously reinforced for us. Because we have seen another person being rewarded for that behavior, we are able to think about it and decide to imitate that behavior because we anticipate that it might result in rewards for us too. Another example of this could be that we do not need to touch a hot utensil to learn that it will burn us and cause pain and discomfort. We may have seen a family member react and have an automatic reflex even with the slightest contact of touching a hot utensil. This is pretty basic in its example, and as our cognitive abilities increase and develop over our lifespan, we are able to deduce and the same through reasoning without having to really observe someone get burnt or having to experience getting burnt ourselves. Nonetheless, being exposed to a model repeatedly and over time is not sufficient for us to learn from them. Bandura suggests that there are 4 cognitive components that are necessary for an observational learning to occur. And when I say necessary, it is a requirement. It is not something that increases with it increasing, but it is something that is a baseline for there to be observational learning. Okay, and if these are not met, it is unlikely that observational learning will occur. Before we go into the 4 components, the model we are exposed to are often based on the environment that we are mostly associated with. If we are in a healthy environment where all individuals are respectful towards one another, we are obviously going to be exposed to models who are respectful and may exhibit other positive behaviors that are pro-social in nature. If, on the other hand, we are exposed to a toxic environment with maybe parents who aggress one another against one another, a neighborhood that has a lot of violence, or a school that enables bullying and conflict, we are likely to be exposed to models who showcase these negative behaviors and antisocial behaviors. But again, mere exposure to a model showcasing or engaging a certain behavior is not enough. The 4 cognitive components that Bandura argues are of attention, retention, motivation, and potential for reproduction. Attention is the process of selecting a model and a behavior they exhibit and focusing our cognitive resources into observing their behaviors over time, but also interpreting their behaviors and the outcomes of those behaviors. Without paying attention, which is almost the entry-level cognition for learning, we are unlikely to learn the behavior from the model. If I'm teaching you and you're watching this video right now and not paying attention, maybe you're on your phone, you're unlikely to learn what I'm talking about. Okay? So attention is very important and it's the entry level. You need at least attention for you to be able to learn and observe a behavior. Retention is our ability to remember that behavior, basically encode and retain it in our long-term store. If we've observed a model support a person in distress, someone who's sad, who's angry, who's just lost someone, and the model has successfully helped supporting them, but we haven't had the ability or potential to imitate this behavior with someone else by supporting them for a really long time, we may not be able to remember how that person or how our model handled the situation. Retention is especially important when there is a significant gap between when we observe our model and when we get the opportunity to imitate the behavior that we observed. Third, we must have the motivation to learn that behavior. And motivation, according to this theory, is based on consequences. If we see our model being rewarded for their behavior, then we may have higher motivation to learn that behavior. But if we see them having negative consequences for engaging in that behavior or being punished for that behavior, we are likely to interpret that as not being beneficial for ourselves and hence will not be motivated to engage in that behavior or will have lesser motivation to engage in that behavior and learn that behavior. Finally, there's the potential for reproduction, which is based on our evaluation of our physical and mental ability to reproduce that behavior. This is in line with the theory of reasoned action and planned behavior. We could have a positive attitude and support from our family and friends and our society, which increases our intention to engage in a specific behavior. But we may not perceive that this behavior is in our control, which would then prevent us from engaging in it. Similarly, we have paid attention to a model in our environment, retained what we observed from them, and also have seen that the model has been rewarded for this behavior, hence increasing our motivation to engage in it. But we may not be able to imitate this behavior because we lack maybe a mental or physical ability that prevents us from learning that behavior. Bandura refers to this as self-efficacy, which is our belief about our own ability to accomplish a task. If we think we are going to fail with a task or a behavior, it is unlikely that we will put effort into learning that behavior. Going back to the example of helping a person in distress, we may be motivated to help them, but if we don't have the social skills or emotional intelligence to support a person, we are likely to avoid imitating that behavior because we fear that we will fail and that this may have negative consequences not only on myself but that person as well, which then goes back to reducing our motivation. While these cognitive factors are necessary factors and are required for learning to occur, there are some factors that increase the potential to learn a behavior by observing a model. The model that you're observing, needs to stand out in contrast to other models in your environment. I partially agree with this idea. We may want to pay attention to someone that stands out from the crowd, but we are also innately wanting to fit into the crowd. So we may learn behaviors that we observe in multiple models, okay, or multiple people. The next factor is that the model's behavior must be consistent. If we see the model we've chosen to observe be helpful only on one occasion and be mean or apathetic in other occasions, we are unlikely to learn that behavior or learn that helping behavior because there's no consistency and we're not observing that behavior over time. The model needs to be liked and respected by the observer, and we are likely to pay attention to or learn from someone we don't find likable, right? And a lot of the times a person is likable to us based on similarities and our perception of our similarity with them. So this person could be someone who belongs to the group that we associate with. And finally, the last piece of factor that increases our potential to learn from a model is whether, again, the model is being rewarded for that behavior. Okay, and that goes back in line with the motivation. Research on the social cognitive theory has focused a lot on how we learn aggression. And a lot of focus has been recently on media and television and video games, and if that vicarious learning and reinforcement of behavior causes or results in individuals learning or increasingly learning aggressive behaviors. Okay, Bandura's Bodo experiment is a classical experiment that has focused on observational learning in children and the learning of aggression. Most of you may have been familiar with this because you've learned it in grade 10 humanities. So what you're going to do for the rest of class now is to watch the video on the experiment, read the article that I've posted on Teams, and also answer the questions on that worksheet. You will post your answers on Padlet, which I have provided the link for on Teams.